The marketplace thrummed with energy, alive with the mingling sounds of merchants shouting their wheeze and buyers. Huggle over prices, Sophia swept into the scene like she owned it. Her flowing, emerald green dress trailed elegantly behind her, and her diamond-studded earrings glittered as if mocking the sun's own brilliance. Her sharp heels clicked against the cobblestones, a sound as commanding as her presence. She held her head high, her perfectly combed hair catching the occasional admiring or perhaps worried glance. People instinctively stepped aside to make way for her, not out of respect, but fear of it. Infamous Khan Kofi, meanwhile, sat cross-legged at the market's edge, a shadow among the chaos. His clothes were tattered and stained, his face hidden beneath the brim of a wide, faded heart, yet his eyes sharp and intelligent track Sophia with a silent intensity. He looked like a man resigned to his fate, but there was an unspoken strength in his presence, a quiet storm marked by humility. Sophia's attention landed on him as she passed, her nose wrinkling, as though offended by his very existence. Kofi was holding out a weather-tined cup, his hands rough and dirty, but his posture surprisingly steady. He didn't shout or beg loudly like the others. He simply extended the cup with a calmness that dared people to judge him. She stopped, her heels digging into the ground, and turned toward him with a look of disgust. A few onlookers paused, sensing an incoming confrontation. Sophia didn't disappoint. Look at you, she sneered loud enough for those nearby to hear, sitting here like a leech, expecting others to hand you what they've walked hard for. Why don't you find some work instead of being a burden? Her voice carried the sharpness of a blade cutting through the Merritt's lively home. Kofi raised his head, slowly meeting her gaze. His face remained calm, unreadable, but his eyes held a depth that made her stir just for a moment. Then he spoke, his voice low but deliberate, each word weighted with meaning. Not all truths are what they seem, Sophia. The familiarity in his voice struck her like a slap, but she quickly masked her unease as scoff escaped her lips as she turned on her heel and strode away, dismissing him with the hauteur of someone who believed herself untouchable. As she disappeared into the crowd, Kofi remained still, his piercing gaze following her. A faint smile ghosted across his lips, more melancholic than amused. Under his breath, he meant, "You'll see soon enough." The market resumed its rhythm, but those who had witnessed the exchange couldn't shake the on his left in its wake. Sophia had moved on, but the encounter would linger like an ominous cloud threatening his storm. Sophia and Kofi's life had once been the picture of a perfect union, or so it seemed. Kofi was a self-made man, the kind who believed in honest work and the quiet satisfaction of a simple life. He had built his mother's business from scratch, guided by values his late father instilled in him: humility, kindness, and the belief that true wealth lay in one's character, not possessions. Sophia, on the other hand, came from a lineage of privilege, raised in a mansion adored with chandeliers and marble flash. She had always seen luxury as the norm, not the exception. When she first met Kofi, she was captivated by his grounded nature. He was unlike the Sutts. Her family paraded before her men who flaunted their wealth but lacked depth. Kofi's humility had been refreshing, even charming for a time. Their love flourished. Kofi would bring her fresh flowers from the countryside, and she would laugh at his stories of navigating village life. But as the years passed, the novelty of his simplicity wore off for Sophia. While Kofi found joy in running his small shop and giving back to the community, Sophia's eyes wandered toward the glamorous lives of her affluent friends. She began to compare their lives to her house, and in her mind, Kofi's modest ambitions no longer seemed endearing. They felt stifling. One evening, after hosting a lavish dinner party for her social cycle, Sophia confronted Kofi in their quiet living room. The glove, the chandelier above them cast sharp shadows across their faces, mirroring the tension in the air. "Do you know how embarrassing it is to sit with women whose husbands are building empires, while mine runs a small shop?" She snapped, her voice trembling with frustration. Kofi looked at her, his eyes soft but pained. "Sophia, I've never measured my we by the size of my bank account. I thought you loved me for who I am, not for what I could buy." Sophia laughed bitterly, her words cutting deeper than she intended. "Maybe I was naive. You're too small-minded to handle my ambitions." "Coffee, I want more than this, more than you can ever give me." The silence that followed was suffocating. Kofi didn't respond. He simply stared at her for a long moment, his eyes searching her for the woman he had fallen in love with, but all he found was the cold weight of her disappointment. By morning, Kofi was gone. There was no note, no explanation, just the empty echo of his absence. Sophia told herself he had abandoned her, too weak to face the truth of her word. She buried her guilt beneath layers of anger, convincing herself she was better off without him. But Kofi hadn't left out of weakness. His disappearance was deliberate, carefully orchestrated with the help of Maris, his childhood friend, and confident. Maris, a fruit vendor at the bustling market, had always been Kof's moral compass, the one who reminded him to hold fast to his principles. When Kofi confided in him about the CS in his marriage, Maz had listened patiently. "Do you truly believe she doesn't love you?" Maz asked, his weathered hands methodically arranging ripe mangoes on his cat. "I don't know anymore," Kofi admitted, "but I need to find out if her love is real or if it's tied to the life I've built for her." Together, they devised a plan that would test Sophia's character. Kofi staged his disappearance, leaving behind his business and his comfortable life. Disguised as a beggar, he would live at the edge of the market where he could observe Sophia from a distance. Maris would act as his eyes and ears, keeping him informed about her actions and words. For Kofi, the decision wasn't easy. He still loved Sophia deeply, but he couldn't continue living in a relationship where he felt valued only for his ability to provide. This test wasn't about punishing her, it was about uncovering the truth. As weeks turned into months, Kofi adjusted to his new life. He endured the stares of disdain from passers-by, the cold nights, and the hunger that gnawed at his stomach, but through it all he remained steadfast. From a spot near the market gate, he watched Sophia maintain her glamorous facade. She laughed with her friends, hosted parties, and carried herself with the same arrogance that had driven him away. Yet he also saw moments of vulnerability when she paused to gaze at the sky or lingered by the market stalls, her face clouded with something that looked like regret. Kofi's resolve wavered at times, but Mars' steady encouragement kept him focused. "Sometimes you have to lose everything to see the truth," Marcus reminded him one night. Kofi clung to those words as he continued his quiet video, waiting for the day when Sophia's true nature would reveal itself. In the months following Kofi's disappearance, Sophia became the embodiment of resilience. Also, she wanted the word to believe. She threw extravagant parties in her Spoing mansion, adoring herself in the finest silk dresses and diamond necklaces. Her laughter rang hollow, but it echoed loud enough to drown out the whispers of her social kill. "Do you think her husband ran off?" one woman whispered behind a Jew fan at age. "More likely she drove him away," another quit, hiding a smack. Sophia dismissed the gossip with a practiced smile and a cold glare. She maintained her status with calculated precision, determined to show everyone she was unfazed by Kof's absence. Yet behind closed doors, loneliness gnawed at her. The mansion felt empty, its grand halls echoing with memories of laughter and love that no longer existed. She spent sleepless nights sitting by the window, staring out at the dark horizon. A small part of her wondered if she had been too harsh, if our words that night had cut too deep. But her pride silenced those thoughts. "He left because he couldn't handle my ambitions," she told herself, using anger to mask her guilt. Sophia's visits to the marketplace became routine. Despite her wealth, she enjoyed the vibrant energy and the way people clamored to serve her. It was during these visits that she began noticing the beggar by the gate, a man whose quiet presence seemed oddly familiar the first time she saw him. He said nothing, he simply watched her, his piercing eyes unsettling in their intensity. On her next visit, as she brushed past him, he murmured, "Even the wealthiest can lose what they cherish most." Sophia froze mid-step, her heart skipping a bit. The words felt eerily personal, but she quickly dismissed him with a sneer. "Crazy old fool," she muttered under her breath, forcing herself to walk away without looking back. Over the following weeks, their encounters became more frequent. Each time, the beggar's words grew more pointed. "Gold shines brightest when it's shared, not hearted. Kindness costs nothing, yet it's priceless." One afternoon, Sophia's ear turned to anise as she approached the gate. Her eyes caught something that made her stomach churn, a small weather pendant tied to the beggar's wrist. It was unmistakable, the same pendant she had given Coffee on their first wedding anniversary. Her mind rested. It can't be, she thought, shaking her head. There are thousands of pendants like that. It's just a coincidence. But the seed of doubt had been planted, and it took root in her thoughts, growing stronger with each passing day. Sophia's carefully constructed facade began to crumble during a high society gala. The event, hosted by a renowned philanthropist, was filled with influential figures discussing charity, work, and social impact topics Sophia found tedious. She attended only to maintain appearances, her jaw dress and confident demeanor masking her growing ones. As the evening progressed, Sophia overheard a group of guests discussing her treatment of the poor. I heard she humiliated a beggar at the market, one man said, his tone dripping with disapproval. Some people don't understand that wealth comes with responsibility, another added, shaking his head. Their words struck a nerve, but Sophia pretended not to hear. She sipped her champagne and laughed at an unrelated joke, determined to maintain her composure. The night took a turn when the host, a prominent philanthropist named Evelyn, approached her. Evelyn was known for her sharp wit and unwavering commitment to social justice. Sophia, she said with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, I've heard about your encounters at the marketplace. Sophia's heart sank, but she forced a polite smile. Oh, you know how rumors are, Evelyn. They tend to exaggerate. Evelyn's expression hardened perhaps, but let me offer you a piece of advice. Wealth means nothing without compassion. You might learn that one day. The words struck like a slap, leaving Sophia momentarily speechless. She excused herself and retreated to the balcony, her hands trembling as she gripped the railing. The city lights sparkled below, but they offered no comfort. For the first time, Sophia felt the weight of judgment, not from the gossiping masses, but from herself. Deep down, she knew Evelyn was right. Her wealth had become her armor, but it was also her prison, isolating her from genuine connections and the person she once was. The encounters with the beggar, the familiar pendant, and Evan's confrontation began to chip away at Sophia's carefully constructed pride. She started noticing things she had ignored before: the hollow laughter at her parties, the empty seat at her dining table, the lingering stares of the beggar, who seemed to see through her facade. One night, as she lay in bed staring at the pendant she had tuned into her jewelry box, a thought struck her like lightning. What if it's not a coincidence? Her chest tightened with a mix of fear and hope. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to whisper the name she had avoided saying aloud. Kofi. The cracks in her pride were growing, but whether she would embrace the truth or retreat into denial remained to be seen. The market was unusually quiet that day, as though the air itself held its breath. Sophia walked briskly, her usual confidence waning as her eyes ded toward the beggar by the gate. Kofi was sitting in his usual spot, his posture calm yet commanding in a way that made her skin prickle. The pendant on his wrist gleamed under the sun, a calm reminder of a growing suspicion. She paused near him, her voice sharp but tinged with unease. You've been following me, haven't you? Kofi looked up slowly, his eyes meeting hers with a calm intensity that unloved her. I'm exactly where I've always been, Sophia, he replied, his voice steady, almost mocking. The crowd began to gather, sensing the tension. Whispers filled the air as Sophia's perfectly curated IM started to crack. Enough of this nonsense, she snapped, her voice trembling. Who are you to speak to me like this? Kofi rose to his feet, his movements deliberate. He removed his tattered heart, revealing a face Sophia thought she'd never see again. The lines on his face were deeper, his beard scruffier, but there was no mistaking him. Her word tilted. Kofi. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but the disbelief and shock were deafening. No, this can't be you. The crowd gasped as mamas writhed through them. Kofi remained silent, his jaw steady, waiting for her to absorb the truth. Without another word, he turned and walked away, leaving Sophia frozen, her mind racing with questions and her chest tightening with humiliation. That evening, Sophia sat in her grand living room, the silence suffocating. The event at the market replayed in her mind like a haunting melody. She couldn't escape. A knock on the door broke her chance. She opened it to find no one there, only an envelope lying on the doorstep. She picked it up cautiously, her fingers trembling as she opened it. Inside was a single piece of Paper with a handwritten note, "If you want to know the truth, find me where love cost nothing." Sophia's breath hitched. The words were cryptic yet familiar, tugging at a memory buried deep within her. She thought of Kofi's love for simple acts of kindness, how he had once spoken passionately about a local shelter that provided refuge to the homeless. Her heart pounded as realization dawned. Could this be where Kofi had been all along? The next morning, Sophia arrived at the shelter, her polished heels clicking against the cracked pavement. The building was modest, its walls adored with faded mirrors of hope and compassion. Children played in the courtyard, their laughter a stark contrast to the churning in her stomach. Inside, she found Kofi surrounded by a group of people. He was no longer the beggar sitting at the market gate. Here he was a leader, his presence commanding respect and admiration. He was helping a young boy tie his shoelaces while an elderly woman patted his shoulder affectionately. Sophia stood frozen in the doorway, unable to reconcile the man before her with the image of the husband she had once dismissed as too small-minded. Before she could gather her thoughts, a woman from the shelter approached her. Her weathered face held a mixture of curiosity and disdain. "Are you Sophia?" the woman asked, her tone sharp. Sophia nodded hesitantly. The woman crossed her arms, her eyes narrowing. "Do you know how lucky you are?" she said, her voice laced with accusation. "That man has done more for strangers than you've ever done for him." Sophia flinched at the words, her guilt washing over her like a tidal wave. She wanted to defend herself, to explain that she hadn't known, but the lump in her throat made it impossible. She watched as Kofi finished tying the boy's shoes and turned to face her. The eyes met, and for a moment the noise of the shelter faded into silence. "Coffee," she said softly, her voice breaking. Why did you leave me like that?" He walked toward her, his expression unreadable. "I didn't leave you, Sophia. I left the person you had become." The words cut deep, but there was no malice in his tone, only a quiet sadness that made her chest ache. As Kofi led her into a small office at the back of the shelter, he began to explain. He told her about the night he left, the pain of realizing that the woman he loved had been consumed by greed and arrogance. He spoke of his decision to live among the poor, not just to test her, but to reconnect with the values that had always defined him. "This shelter saved me," he said, gesturing around the room. "It reminded me of who I am, but more than that, it showed me the kind of person I need by my side." Tears would up in Sophia's eyes as the weight of her actions crashed down on her. She thought of the nights she had spent justifying her behavior, the cruel words she had held at him, the way she had judged others without a second thought. "Kofi," she whispered, her voice trembling, "I was wrong about everything. I don't know how to make it right, but I want to try." Kofi studied her for a long moment before nodding. "It's not about what you say, Sophia, it's about what you do." Sophia spent the rest of the day at the shelter observing Kofi as he interacted with the residents. She saw the way they looked at him with gratitude, admiration, and love. It was a contrast to the superficial relationship she had cultivated in her social circle. For the first time in years, Sophia felt small, not in a degrading way, but in a way that made her realize how much she had to learn. That night, as she sat alone in her grand bedroom, she looked at herself in the mirror and saw not a wealthy socialite, but a woman who had lost her way. The journey toward redemption wouldn't be easy, but for the first time she felt ready to take the first step. Sophia stood in the quiet corner of the shelter, her hands clasped nervously in front of her. She had spent the day watching Kofi move through the space like he belonged there, laughing with the children, consoling the elderly, and organizing with a sense of purpose. She barely recognized when Kofi finally approached her. His expression was calm but distant, as contrast to the warmth he had shown to everyone else. "Kofi," she began, her voice trembling, "I know I can't undo the past, but I want to make things right." He tilted his head slightly. "Studying her words are easy, Sophia," he said, his tone measured, "but actions show the truth." Sophia nodded, her chest tight with anticipation. "Tell me what I need to do." Kofi crossed his arms, his gaze unwavering. "Walk here," he said simply. "Spend a month at the shelter. Help the people you once looked down on. If you want forgiveness, prove you've changed." Sophia's heart sunk. A month in the shelter, the thought was daunting. This was the word far removed from her glittering parties and designer gowns. But she knew she couldn't refuse. "I'll do it," she said, her voice did despite the fear gnawing at her. The first few days were grueling. Sophia found herself scrubbing floors, serving meals, and folding laundry in the dimly lit shelter. The work was physically demanding, and the stares of the residents, many of whom had heard about her reputation, were no less exhausting. "You're the one who mocked coffee at the market on you?" an older woman asked one day, her tea sharp. Sophia nodded silently, her cheeks burning with shame. At night, she would return to her empty mansion, her body aching and her pride buttered. But somewhere beneath the discomfort, a small spark began to flicker, a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. Over time, Sophia began to connect with the people at the shelter. She listened to their stories, tales of loss, resilience, and survivor that humbled her in ways she hadn't expected. One day, she met a young girl named Amina, who had been separated from her family during a flood. Amina's quiet bravery reminded Sophia of her own childhood, and she became determined to help. Sophia worked tirelessly, making calls and navigating bureaucratic halls to locate Amina's family. When the reunion finally happened, the sight of Amina running into her mother's arms brought tears to Sophia's eyes. For the first time, the residents of the shelter looked at her with something other than skepticism. "You've done something good," one of them said, offering her a small smile. As Sophia settled into her role at the shelter, she noticed something strange. Supplies arrived regularly, far more than the modest donations the shelter seemed to receive. When she asked Maris, the fruit vendor and Koff's old friend, about it, he hesitated before answering. "It's Koff." Maros finally admitted. "He's been managing your businesses in secret, even as a beggar. He made sure you didn't lose everything." Sophia's heart sunk. She had assumed Kofi had abandoned her completely, but instead he had been protecting her from afar, ensuring her life didn't fall apart despite her flaws. That evening, she confronted Kofi in a small office at the shelter. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked, her voice breaking. Kofi looked up from his desk, his expression unreadable. "It wasn't about you knowing," he said simply. "It was about making sure you didn't lose everything while you found your way back to yourself." His words left her speechless. The depth of his love and sacrifice was more than she had ever imagined, and the weight of her past actions pressed down on her like a tidal wave. The revelation deepened Sophia's guilt, but it also strengthened her determination to change. She threw herself into her walk at the shelter with renewed vigor, no longer seeing it as a punishment, but as a chance to rebuild her character. She began organizing fundraisers, leveraging her social connections to bring in resources for the shelter. She used the skills she had honed in her old life, not for selfish gain, but to make a difference. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, Kofi watched her lead a group of volunteers. He laughed with the children, her once haughty demeanor replaced with genuine warmth. Maris approached Kofi and nudged him with a knowing smile. "Looks like she's proven herself," he said. Kofi nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Maybe she is." Sophia's mother. The shelter transformed her in ways she hadn't thought possible. She no longer saw the world through the lens of wealth and status, but through the eyes of the people she had once dismissed. The pivotal moments came when a young man at the shelter, inspired by her efforts, said, "You've given us more than food or money. You've shown us that people can change." Sophia realized that in trying to earn Kofi's forgiveness, she had found something far more valuable: her own redemption. The grand hall was adorned with soft lights and elegant decorations, but this time it wasn't for one of Sophia's lavish parties. It was a charity auction organized to support the shelter that had become her second home. The room buzzed with anticipation as guests admired the glittering collection of Sophia's most prized possessions, displayed forbidding jewelry, designer handbags, and even family heirlooms. Sophia stood at the podium, her once haughty demeanor replaced by a quiet confidence. She looked out at the crowd, recognizing familiar faces from her old life. Taking a deep breath, she began. "Tonight isn't about wealth or status," she said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "It's about redemption, growth, and giving back. I mocked the man who loved me most and judged those I didn't understand. I let pride blind me to what truly matters. Today, I stand here humbled and grateful for the chance to make things right." The room fell silent, her Words sinking in for the first time, Sophia felt no need to impress or justify. She spoke from her heart. The applause that followed wasn't the polite kind she was used to. It was genuine. The auction raised more than enough to secure the shelter's future, but for Sophia the greatest victory was the respect she saw in the eyes of those who had once doubted her. The following day, Kofi approached her at the shelter, his expression serious. "Sophia, you've come far," he began, "but this isn't about me or the people. Here it's about you." Sophia frowned, sensing a change in his tone. "What are you saying, Kofi?" "I think it's time for me to leave," he said quietly, his words cutting through her like a knife. "You've proven your strength, Sophia. You don't need me anymore." Panic rose in her chest. "No, Kofi, I need you not because I'm weak, but because I love you." Tears welled in her eyes as she pleaded, "Don't leave." Kof's lips skeeved into a gentle smile, the tension easing from his face. "You've proven your love not to me, but to yourself, that what matters most." In that moment their shared journey came. Kofi embraced her, the want of his love washing away the pain of the past. Together, they decided to dedicate their lives to helping others, transforming the shelter into a sanctuary of hope. Sophia and Kofi, once separated by pride and misunderstanding, now stood united, a powerful symbol of humility, love, and redemption. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed, please subscribe our channel for more interesting tales.